So let's take a look at how the equilibrium in the aggregate labor market, or the equilibrium quantity of labor in the aggregate labor market, can be used to determine what real GDP would be in the economy overall. So if down here we have our aggregate labor market, well, in our labor market, the equilibrium amount of people that are employed, where supply of labor is equal to demand for labor, well, this equilibrium quantity of labor, one, tells us how many people are employed, but it also tells us the amount of input, amount of labor input that's being used by the economy overall. So what we can do is we can actually use this equilibrium quantity of labor found in the labor market as our input into the aggregate production function. We'll assume that capital and technology will hold that constant, and then we can see how real GDP will change when there's a change in the labor input. So how do we connect this? Well, we just take this equilibrium quantity, and because the units on both x-axes are the same in the aggregate production function and the labor market, we can just see what our equilibrium quantity is and use that as the value of our labor input. Well, if we know what our labor input is, and we understand what our aggregate production function is, well then, given this relationship between labor and real GDP, as specified by this aggregate production function, we can find what theoretically our real GDP should be. We'll just call it real GDP 1. We won't actually give values. We'll just give the theoretical idea of how the labor market and the aggregate production function are connected. So just to summarize, all you're doing is finding the equilibrium in the labor market where supply of labor is equal to demand for labor, and then using this equilibrium, and we make the assumption, I should specify that we make the assumption that the economy is at full employment. Because if quantity demanded for labor is not equal to quantity supplied of labor, there's going to be unemployment. We just make the assumption that we're at the full employment level. If you remember, the full employment level will be the unemployment level when all unemployment is either frictional or structural. There's no cyclical unemployment. We'll talk about cyclical unemployment in a little bit, specifically when we model it, but the general idea is that we find this equilibrium quantity of labor in the labor market, and we take this equilibrium quantity of labor and we use it as our labor input, and it helps us determine what our real GDP is. Okay, so what happens? So let's just assume we're starting at this equilibrium point. So what happens when there's a shock to economy? When output prices drop, when demand for output drops, when labor productivity drops, or when input prices rises? Well, what's going to happen is, if this is our initial demand for labor, and to start off, we're going to assume that wages are flexible, that if the equilibrium wage in the labor market is below the current wage, we'll assume that there's wage flexibility and the wages can drop. We talked about how when wages are rigid, it causes a greater increase in unemployment during recession times or lack of growth periods, we could say. Well, we're not going to assume that. We're not going to assume wage rigidity to start off. We're going to keep it simple and assume that wages are flexible. So what happens when there's a negative shock to the economy? Well, demand for labor is going to decrease. And if demand for labor decreases, call it DL2, then our new equilibrium quantity of labor is going to be lower than it previously was. Call this QE2, call that QE1. So there's a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of labor. Well, what does that mean for output? Well, when the input decreases, it follows, I'll make it a little more distinguishable in red, it follows that our real GDP will also drop. So real GDP goes from real GDP 1 down to real GDP 2. Why? Because demand for labor decreased due to the negative shock to the economy, resulting in a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of labor, resulting in a drop in real GDP. Okay, now let's assume that wages are rigid. Wages are not flexible. They can't drop below the current wage rate. So what does that mean? Well, if our current wage rate is at this W star, well, if that's our current wage rate, if our demand for labor drops because of a negative shock to the economy, and wages can't drop below this W star level, essentially this price floor, well, the amount of people that are employed, the equilibrium quantity of people employed in the aggregate labor market is now going to be even lower than when wages are flexible. So what does that mean? Well, if this is our, let's call it, unflexible wages equilibrium in the labor market, well, that means our labor input is going to be less than it previously was. If our input was lower, then we can see output is also going to be lower. So, just to summarize, demand for labor drops. When demand for labor drops, if wages are flexible, meaning wages can decrease, well, we're still going to have a drop in our labor input, and we're still going to have a drop in our real GDP, but it's not going to be as great as when wages are not flexible. Why? Because the equilibrium quantity in the labor market is going to be a lot lower. That's going to cause a lower input into the aggregate production function. With less input, we're going to get an even lower amount of real GDP, or even lower amount of output. Now I'm just going to focus on the labor market. So we understand that with non-flexible wages, we're going to have a bigger decrease in the labor input, which is going to cause a bigger decrease in real GDP. Here, from now on, I'm just going to focus on the labor market and probably emphasize more about when wages are unflexible as opposed to when they are flexible. Give a more realistic interpretation. So before we start intimately taking a look at the labor market, I just want to talk about some of the perpetuating problems that an economy is going to run into when there's a shock to the economy, and specifically when there's a decrease in the demand for labor. So what happens? Demand for labor decreases. What does that mean? Unemployment's going to rise. Well, if unemployment's going to rise, that means households are going to have less income. If households have less income, they're going to buy less stuff, which means firms are going to receive even less revenue, which means demand for labor is going to continue to decrease. And then we continue to perpetuate the problem. Lower demand for labor, higher unemployment, consumption continues to drop, and firms continue to make less money until we bottom out. And so that's what we're going to talk about next, is we're going to show, yes, we have the decrease in demand for labor, but then we'll show the multiplying effect until we hit the trough, until we hit the bottoming out of the recession, and then we'll start seeing a recovery, and there's certain kind of natural forces that are going to cause the recovery to occur. So that's what we'll talk about after we model the multiplying effect to the labor market.